for those people that maybe aren't able to join us tonight, or something else came up and they'll get a chance to watch it later. So I just want to let everybody know that you guys will be all on mute while the program is going on. And I'm sure that all of us will have some great questions. I'm so glad you're going to want to ask questions. If you would like to wait till the end to answer them, we will have a small question and answer session. And then if you don't want to forget your question, if you would like to type that in the chat, we will get to them at the end of the program as well. So again, Nebraska has declared March as Nebraska Outdoor Women's Month. It was a proclamation by our governor here in the state. And so we would love to celebrate that. We want to show people that women are very relevant in the outdoors. They always have been, but let's go ahead and show them a whole month dedicated to that. And not just March, we want to show every month like that. But March is our official proclamation month. So we will go ahead and kickstart off our event here. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Theodore Roosevelt, who will go ahead and deliver his awesome program tonight. So go ahead, Theodore. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. You know, it is a delight and a bully great fun to be with everyone tonight. You know, normally I am there in person in front of you and my good friends in Nebraska who I miss dearly because of all the things going on. Unfortunately, I can't be there, but I'm glad I can join you here via this amazing device that apparently our government has created for us so that we can communicate. So it's a delight to be here and wonderful opportunity to join you all. Now, of course, I want to begin. As president, my contributions to work in protecting both the American landscape and the animals are well documented, and of course continue today with our elected leaders as well as private citizens. But it takes more than one person to protect our resources. And tonight, I wish to share the story of our wilderness warriors. Good friends like my friend here, Mr. John Muir. Of course, John was a Scotsman who enjoyed the wilderness and the great landscapes of the Pacific West, and was keen to share his enjoyment of them with his Sierra colleagues. The gentlemanly pursuit of outdoor adventure meant that books and magazines flourished where outdoorsmen and outdoor items were highlighted. No one exemplified this more than a popular publication of the time called Forest and Stream magazine, run by my very good friend, George Byrd Grinnell. Now, the magazine focused on hunting and fishing for the gentlemen of the day. But to be honest, it wasn't a wise understanding of those who pursued these recreations, because as many times as the men were reading it, it was also read by the women of the house, who would write to the magazine and ask why they were not included in the stories. So numerous were the letters that soon a ladies' department column was added, as well as a story feature that ran as a serial called the Modern Diana column. Now, it's important to understand that while men claimed the role of hunter and provider across this great country, many women were taking up arms and rods in pursuit of the enjoyment of the outdoor recreation as much as the men. In fact, there were true trailblazing wilderness warriors who, instead of armor, wore long skirts and fashionable headwear. Some enjoyed the pursuit of the game as much or more than their male counterparts, and I will share a few of those with you here in just a bit. Now, there are those who've also found preservation and protection an important warrior act. During the Gilded Age, it became fashionable for women to wear hats decorated with plumes. These plumes became from woodpeckers and bluebirds, owls, herons, and warblers, thousands of which were killed each year. In 1896, Harriet Henway and her cousin Mina B. Hall held tea parties for the wealthy women of Boston, where they urged them not to wear their feathered hats and invited them to join a society for the protection of said birds. Having gained the support of many of these fashionable women, Hemingway and Hall then organized meetings between leaders of the high society and prominent New England ornithologists, paving the way for the creation of the Massachusetts Audubon Society, with over 900 women joining their efforts. Now, young girls and women would become the force of nature of wilderness. Of course, I wish this photo of me as a young boy didn't look so feminine, but alas, it was the way that most of us were photographed when we were young. I had an elder sister, so my sister Bammy, of course, so it was not because of that my mother craved a daughter that this photo was created. You see, to see this photo, you would not believe that I was a sickly boy. not expected to live beyond 4 years. But it is true. Now, unfortunately, I was born with a terrible disease, a disease called asthma. Felt as if I had an elephant standing on my chest. And any time that I would have one of my terrible attacks, my mother or father would try to figure out how they could comfort me. Now, they brought in a physician of the day, and the physician said, "I'm afraid, Mr. and Mrs. Roosevelt, there's nothing we can do to cure young Theodore, but we can comfort him. Anytime that he has one of his terrible asthma attacks, Mrs. Roosevelt, you brew up a large pot of thick black coffee, and you go ahead and you pour that into his gullet and have him drink as much as he possibly can. You see, back in the day, they knew that it was drowsiness which causes asthma. So the idea was to keep me awake as much as they could." Now, my father didn't necessarily agree with this. He believed that what was going on might be best cured by tobacco. Of course, Dr. Batty's asthma cigarettes were really high regarded, but my father believed that that was just window dressing for how it should really be treated. So instead, he would light up a large pipe of cigar, and I was expected to smoke that to open my airways. Now, if neither of that worked, the coffee nor the tobacco, the final solution was this: a large glass of Kentucky, or actually in this case, Tennessee whiskey, which I was to drink quickly to shock my system. Remember that picture? I look like the happiest child alive. But truth be told, I was miserable. But see, my father had another idea. He had been reading about what they had been doing in Europe, called the taking of air. And so anytime that I would have one of my terrible attacks, he would drive my little body out into the wilderness, and he would kick me out of the carriage, and he would say to me, "Theodore, breathe." And it was there, when I was out in the wilderness, where I would begin to experience the fresh breath that I'd always craved. And I would go back home with the things that I had filled into my pockets, the specimens that I had discovered, perhaps the turtle shell or the snake skin, or if I was lucky enough, a live frog or two that I could bring into my room. And I would begin to read. Now, of course, my favorite books were about the things that I could not do. You see, because I was so sick, I spent the majority of my time in bed. And the things that I most absorbed and most enjoyed were books. The Origin of the Species, a phenomenal book about the transition of things to man walking. Or the Audubon, with the Society of Birds, and telling me about the different birds. Or, of course, anything by any author that had something about a boy. My favorite being a gentleman by the name of Mr. Maynard Reed. And Maynard Reed would talk about the variety of ways that a boy had stowed away onto a ship. And that boy would describe what it was that he had seen as he was going along. Now, of course, along with books, the other thing that I enjoyed immensely was the opportunity to call birds onto my windowsill. Because I was stuck in bed, all I could do was whistle and bring the birds in. And then there I could look them up in my different picture books and determine what kind of species they were. My fascination with these animals and my experience of going out with my father into the wilderness would promote that idea that perhaps the outdoors was the best place for me. After all, it was a place that I was not coughing or wheezing. It was a place where I could see the things that I had been reading about in my picture books. And for the first time, I could actually put my hands on the things that excited me most. Now, of course, my parents quickly identified the fact that I was interested in these things. And so they would put tasks in front of me, jobs per se, that I was supposed to do. Things like studying the blackfish. My uncle next door, Robert V. Roosevelt, was considered the father of the fishes. And so he would help me with my book reports. And then during the summer, we would spend our time in the Adirondacks or out in Oyster Bay, New York. And I was there. I could study the birds that I had seen. And eventually I would write a book called The Summer Birds of the Adirondacks in Franklin County, New York. I was only 10 when I wrote said book, but it soon became a passion for me. The idea of sketching an animal, of describing that animal and its habitat, of publishing a book, it became my heart's passion. Of course, spending my time out in the wilderness, it would find my passion too. And these passions would soon find me at Harvard, studying to be a naturalist. It was there that I would spend my summers going into the places in the woods, such as Maine here, with my lifelong friend and sometime business partner, Bill Sewell, and his friend William Wingate. There, they would teach me the skills of the wild and turn me into my own, wilderness warrior. But in the woods of Maine lived much more hardy creatures than those two. Women like Cornelia Thurza Crosby, or Fly Rod as she was probably known in the day. She was the first registered Maine guide. Now, you see, this is important to understand because in 1897, the Maine legislature passed a bill requiring hunting guides to be registered with the state. Maine registered 1,316 guides in that first year. Fly Rod Crosby was number one. Now, Crosby was strong in promoting Maine's outdoor sports at shows in metropolitan areas and wrote a popular column that appeared in many newspapers around the country. But it was nationally published in the magazine Fly Rod's Notebook, where her efforts helped to attract thousands of would-be outdoorsmen and women to the woods and streams of Maine. Crosby attracted generations of tourists through the wilderness visitors and her popular newspaper columns of her hunting and fishing tales in Rangeley Lake, Maine. Let me phrase it in her own words. I am a plain woman of uncertain age, standing 6 feet in my stockings. I scribble a bit for various sporting journals, and I would rather fish any day than go to heaven. Fly Rod was truly a model to the young women around the nation, bolstering a personal philosophy of athleticism and independence, often not found in other women of her time. As a matter of fact, she gained a great bit of fame for her exhibit at the New York Sportsman Exposition in 1898. At that exhibit, she displayed a recreated hunting camp, even with a log cabin. Throughout the duration of the exhibit, she wore a scandalously short skirt which displayed her characteristics of a woman who broke the social norms of her time period. Some of her greatest achievements include becoming Maine's first registered guide, shooting the last legally killed caribou in Maine, and catching hundreds of thousands of fish on the fly rod. Now, across our great nation for recreation and enjoyment, sometimes even survival, women enjoyed many wilderness pursuits. Born into poverty in 1860 in Western Ohio, Phoebe Ann Mosey began trapping and hunting at the age of 7 to support her widowed mother and siblings. By the age of 15, revenues from her shooting skills had paid off for the mortgage on her mother's farm. Yet despite of her celebrity as a sharpshooting star, it is well known that she much preferred hunting to commercial shooting. Her skills led to her fame as who we know her today, Annie Oakley. Her skills as a marksperson were almost beyond belief. Now, while women didn't have the ability to cast a vote in government at the time, they certainly had the ability to influence action. Companies quickly saw the growing interest in products that catered to them, and they were fast to expand their place in the ever-growing marketplace. Women were not only becoming consumers of wilderness products and fashion, they were becoming influencers of the outdoor business. There were few influencers who had made such an impact in the sales and marketing of products as Annie Oakley. Annie would become a powerhouse working for Buffalo Bill's Wild West, giving her worldwide exposure and demanded by brand builders worldwide. Of course, what would you expect her to promote? Hair care. Of course, she also promoted weaponry of many types. Remarkable, too, was Paulina Brandt. Born in the Adirondack Mountains in 1885, Paulina published her first hunting story in Field and Stream magazine at the age of 9, without using her name, of course, and later published one of the first major books on deer hunting, Trails of Enchantment, under the pen name Paul Brandt. Brandt's books contained wonderful, startling photos and remarkably detailed information on the white-tailed deer biology, as well as conservation commentary. But it would be me as a young assemblyman in the state of New York where I would begin my own wilderness journey. It was there that I was passing laws and doing a variety of things when I found out from my beautiful bride that we were going to be parents. And I decided that before the baby came, I was going to go on one of my great adventures I had always imagined. And the thing I wanted to do is I wanted to mount an amazing animal on the wall of my new home that I was building out in Oyster Bay, New York. It was this that I wanted, the great bison. Scientific name, of course, bison. So good they named it twice. Of course, what I wanted was one of these amazing animals before they were all gone. Because you see, at the time, when Mr. Lincoln was president, there were already over 40 million of these amazing creatures across the Great Plains. But now, as the railroads had moved across the country and the decimation of the herds had occurred through careless wilderness hunting and men shooting out of trains, the population had dwindled to less than 4 million in the entire country. Now, I was expecting that 10,000 of them were going to be in a place called, now known as Medora, North Dakota. I had expected those 10,000 to be there, but when I got off the train ready for my hunt, the man that I had hunted told me, Mr. Roosevelt, I have very bad news. All 10,000 bison were murdered less than 2 weeks ago. There are no bison left in the Dakotas. Well, I was, of course, heartbroken, but we went on our ride anyway, looking. Well, we did find one on the far edge of western Montana, and when I saw him, I shot him, and I did a dance around him as I cut off his head and sent it to St. Paul, Minnesota to be mounted. Before I left, though, the men there that I had met had convinced me that because the bison were gone, they were going to be grazing cattle, and that it would be a good investment for me, and so I purchased a small group of head that I would use as an investment later on. I went back and I told my beautiful wife that I had invested in a herd, and she proceeded to tell me of all the things that I had done wrong by leaving. Of course, she was right. She was getting much larger, and by the time we had gotten and settled down, I was back in New York passing laws in Albany, and she was in New York City living with my mother being cared for. I was going to leave one day before the baby was to be born when I received a telegraph. Theodore, you're the proud father of a bouncing baby girl. Well, of course, we were very happy. We slapped each other on the back. I think I even had a cigar for the first time since I'd been a child that day. And then I got another telegraph only a few moments later, and this one was not as good. It said, Theodore, come home quickly. Alice, your wife is dying. When I got to the house, sure enough, poor Alice was almost in a coma. She was sweating profusely. She would respond to her name, but that was about it. And as I was working with her, trying to bring as much Roosevelt strength as I could, the doctor came from upstairs and he said, if you want to say goodbye to your mother, you best do so now. You see, my mother was dying too. I went upstairs and my poor mother died in my arms. 2 hours later, I went back downstairs and watched my poor wife suffer for 4 more hours until she too died. I lost my wife and my mother on the same exact day in my home in New York City, Valentine's Day, 1884. All I could do was put an X in my diary and put the light has gone out of my life. I had no idea what I was going to do. I went back and immersed myself in my work, but my heart wasn't in it. I only had one thing left, the cattle that I had bought out in the Dakotas. And so I left my baby daughter with my sister Bammy, and I went off to the Dakotas to become a cowboy. It was there that I began to heal after the amazing loss of my wife and my mother. And it was there that I began to find myself, where the true romance of my life began. I would spend my days on the field, hunting animals, observing animals, working with my men as we raised our cattle. And it was there as well that I would begin to write again. Sitting on the porch of my cabin, the Elkhorn Ranch, I would begin to write about my experiences of hunting in the Badlands of the Dakotas. You see, it was a rugged land with amazing vistas and large game, but it was an amazing place to just spend time watching the great river run and imagine myself as the great wilderness warrior. As a matter of fact, I began to pen a book that became known as The Hunting Trips of a Ranchman. You see, everyone wanted to know what had happened to me after I had left the assembly in New York. And so the book was a bestseller. And there were many wonderful stories. One of my favorites of all was about the great white-tailed deer, which I believe you now call the mule deer. When I wrote the book, I sent it off for publication, and of course that man at Field and Stream reviewed it, George Byrd Grinnell. Now he himself said, I'm sure Roosevelt's a fine young man, but he doesn't know a darn thing about the white-tailed deer. Well, I decided now that I was a cowboy in the Dakotas, I was going to do the proper thing. I was going to go to New York and punch him in the nose. Well, when I sat down with him, George Byrd Grinnell went page by page through my book, and he told me all the things that I'd gotten wrong. He was right. He'd forgotten more about the white-tailed deer than I would ever know about the white-tailed deer. And then he began to tell me about his ideas of conservation, about the fact that we should be regulating our animal game taking, that it shouldn't be willy-nilly, that there should be rules around it, and that us gentlemen hunters should set the standard. He was right. So he and I created something called the Boone and Crockett Club. It is now the foundation for everything that is known as the North American model of conservation, which is used across the country. And of course, we all know of George Byrd Grinnell because of that society that he began, the Audubon. But as well, he saved over 2 million acres worldwide through the New York Zoological Society, which protects acreage around the world using that conservation model that he and I developed. But you know what? It wasn't just George Byrd Grinnell who was an influencer. Now, George Byrd and I didn't know that I was going to become president of the United States. But you see, I had become vice president after the Spanish-American War, and I was serving under Mr. McKinley when he was at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, when a madman shot him. Now, he told me, Roosevelt, continue on your conservation efforts. I'm fine. And he was for quite a while until he got a sepsis and he succumbed to his wound. And soon I was brought into this house right here. Of course, back then it was called the Executive Mansion. It was not until I officially called it the White House and renamed it, because everyone, of course, in Washington called it the Great White House on the Hill. And it was there that I began my legislation to create a conservation movement. We begin with this, those ladies' hats that we spoke to earlier. 9 million birds a year were being murdered for ladies' hats. And of course, these ladies' hats were very, very important. As a matter of fact, they were so important that large guns like these were the ones that they were using to hunt. You see, a large gun like this could shoot an entire flock. The punt gun would take 2 men, one standing at the top to support the barrel, and the second one firing. But instead of getting 1 bird, they could get 10 birds, or 20 birds, or even more birds. Again, we come back to that important woman who helped recover, or to recruit, I should say, 900 women who became important parts of the legacy of protecting those amazing birds. And together, they worked with Frank Chapman, an ornithologist, to come to me and say, Mr. President, you must do something. I said, I don't know what I can do. Of course, I'm just the president. They said, sir, we believe that you can use the strength of your presidency to set aside certain pieces of land that have significance. And I said, if that's true, let's make it so. And we created the very first wildlife refuge off the coast of Florida, Pelican Island. Now, Pelican Island was a rookery for pelicans and white egrets, some of the most popular plumes that were used in ladies' hats. And of course, there we hired the very first game warden, Mr. Paul Kruger, who was an important legacy builder in saving those amazing creatures. But you see, it wasn't just the birds that were important. Laura Lynn White was an American activist known for founding the California Club, working to preserve groves of redwoods in California and promoting the City Beautiful movement. Now, she brought pragmatism and causes that championed the idea that there was more than just wilderness that we needed to protect. Women had not secured the right to vote, so she used her affluence and her social status to accomplish her goals to promote the protection of nature and the improvement of life for city dwellers. Unlike Muir, White did not draw a sharp distinction between nature and urban beauty because she saw the place for both. in economic development, so long as its excesses were moderated. She was willing to abide by the social norms of her time while nevertheless using those norms to further her own aims, and hence move forward with the responsibility and influence of the women in public. She wasn't alone. Anna Comstock was born to progressive, loving parents who taught her that girls could do whatever they chose. Like me, she was a prodigious reader and would educate herself on various topics. After attending high school, she went to Cornell University to study modern languages and literature. There she met her future husband, John Henry Harry Comstock, during his zoologic course at Cornell. Now, Harry became an assistant professor of entomology at Cornell, and after their marriage, he was appointed chief entomologist at the USDA. Now, Anna received a salary from the USDA to write notes and answers to questions about agriculture. But Anna was also illustrating insects for Harry since before their marriage, and her detailed images helped him identify species. She eventually became a natural history illustrator based on popular reception of her drawings. Then she re-entered Cornell and studied entomology and received a BS. In her spare time, she learned engraving to help illustrate her own books and hers and Harry's books, and she became an assistant professor of nature study at Cornell and wrote many articles on botany and entomology. She also wrote entomology and zoology texts for both adults and children, and wrote the book that is still in publication today and used by many, the Handbook of Nature Study. Of course, she wasn't the only amazing woman living in the period. Hallie Daggett was the very first woman hired as a fire lookout by the United States Forest Service. Now, the story is quite interesting because she actually had two men that were in front of her who applied for the job. It was a tough job, 6,400 feet in the air at Eddy's Gulch Lookout Station at the top of Klamath Peak on the Klamath National Forest in Northern California. Now, the two men were woefully unqualified, and so he wrote to his boss to tell him the news that he was hiring a woman. Well, let me quote him. This individual has all the requisites of a first-class lookout. The novelty of the proposition which has been unloaded upon me and which I am now enduring to pass up to you may perhaps take your breath away, and I hope your heart is strong enough to stand the shock. It is this. One of the most untiring and enthusiastic applicants which I have for the position is Miss Hallie Morse Daggett, a wide-awake woman of 30 years who knows and has traversed every trail on the Salmon River watershed and is thoroughly familiar with every foot of the district. She is an ardent advocate of the Forest Service and seeks the position in evident good faith, and gives her solemn assurance that she will stay with her posts faithfully until she is recalled. She is absolutely devoid of the timidity which is ordinarily associated with her sex, as she is not afraid of anything that walks, creeps, or flies. Reminds me of a lot of you Nebraska women. Daggett worked alone on this lookout for over 15 summers. I imagine she fulfilled her job quite well. Now, she wasn't the only one. Rosalie Barrow Edge was such a ferocious advocate of the protection of the wildlife that the New Yorker once called her the only unselfish, indomitable hellcat in the history of conservation. After developing an interest in bird watching, she was horrified to discover that 70,000 bald eagles were being slaughtered in the Alaska Territory, but that existing conservation groups didn't care because bald eagles weren't rare at the time. She founded the Emergency Conservation Committee, which was dedicated to protecting all species of birds and animals, common and rare alike. She also ended decades of hawk and eagle shootings on a ridge in the Appalachian Mountains by buying the property and turning it into the world's first refuge for birds of prey. Now, of course, there's my own entry into the fame of conservation, and it all came from this, of one of these I have right here, this little bear. Well, of course, the story begins with me going off into the wilderness in Missouri to hunt a black bear to ship back to the Smithsonian. Now, the Mississippi black bear was quite a rare bear, and I had spent a long time, actually 3 complete days, waiting to get one, but one never arrived. Well, it was finally the final day, and I was in a hurry to finish my hunt. And I told the guide that under no uncertain terms we were to get a bear today, or the hunt would be done. Well, he assured me that one would be coming. And so he went off into the woods with his dogs, and I could hear them off in the distance, and soon the barking was gone, and I could hear nothing at all. So I decided to go to the lunch wagon to have a bite to eat. Well, of course, you know what happens once I got there. The bear arrived just as I had left. Well, of course, the guide was looking around trying to figure out what happened, and he couldn't, and he called, "Where's Roosevelt?" He sent someone to find me, and he found me in the lunch wagon. He said, "Mr. Roosevelt, come quickly, sir. We have gotten your bear." But here's what's happened in the meantime. That bear had come out of the woods, had looked around, and decided that he wanted to go back in. And the dogs had blocked his way. If he went left, the dogs went left. If he went right, the dogs went right. Finally, the bear decided his only option was to go right through the center of the dogs. And when he did so, he began to get nipped at by the dogs. Now, this, of course, angered and frightened the bear. And he finally reached out and he grabbed one of the dogs and he shook the dog and he killed that dog. Now, the guide, Mr. Collier, could not afford to lose even a single one of his valuable animals, but he wanted me to shoot the bear, and so he thought for a moment. He took the butt end of his rifle and he hit the bear over the head and he knocked him out. And of course, he didn't want the bear to get away, so he tied the end of the bear to a tree, his head in one end of the rope and his rope, the tree in the other, and he called for me. "Roosevelt, here, sir, is your bear to shoot." Of course, I was a fresh new president, only 6 months into my job. The newspaper reporters were with me. And I looked at that poor innocent bear bleeding from the head tied to a tree, and I said, "I will not shoot that bear. That would be unsportsmanlike." Of course, the newspaper men were writing the story about how President Roosevelt would not shoot the bear, and they did not have a photo. So when they sent the story out, a young man by the name of Berryman drew this cartoon, me drawing the line in Mississippi. You see, I wouldn't shoot that bear. Soon the story went around the world, and when I got back to Washington, D.C., my desk was piled with letters of all sorts from all over the globe saying what a fair man that I was, that I did not shoot that poor innocent bear. Of course, it wasn't like this. It wasn't a small Teddy's bear. It was a large mother bear at the time. But, of course, the illustration didn't show that. You see, a toy maker had seen the illustration, and he had an idea. What if he could take one of his toys and rename it Teddy's Bear? So he sent a note to me. He said, "Mr. President, I would like to use your name in commemoration of your great hunt." And I sent a note back and I said, "I have no problem with anyone using my name for commerce, but I doubt anyone will buy a small bear named after me." Of course, we all know better now, don't we? We all have these, hopefully, in our house at home. Mine sits faithfully next to me, and when I'm gone, I have one dressed just like me to sit next to Mrs. Roosevelt. Now, of course, as president, I did accomplish a great deal. I doubled the number of national parks in our system. Of course, a great accomplishment which continues today. Our most recent national park added last year. And of course, through something called the Antiquities Act, I began to save many places which we now call national monuments. Hopefully, you folks have all been to this one, not far from you, just north, in a place called Montana, Devil's Tower. And of course, all of those bird reserves, that first one starting out that we had talked about out in Florida, became 51 federal bird reserves, as well as 4 national game preserves. Of course, today that national refuge system is much larger and much greater than it was in my day. And of course, the most important one to me of all, the United States Forest Service. You see, we were clear cutting down all of our trees, and I knew that if I didn't do something, soon all of our trees would be gone. I brought in a very important man by the name of Mr. Gifford Pinshaw to help me out with my efforts, and he and I together saved our amazing trees. Together, we would create 150 national forests, and we would preserve over 100 million acres of trees. Together, with all of these conservationists in tow, we were able to preserve 230 million acres of land. That's the equivalent of 86,000 acres for every single day I was president. For you and your children and your children's children. For there is nothing in this world that is greater than the amazing beauty of our wilderness. We should see to it that these places are preserved, their majestic beauty left unmarred. We owe it to the generations that follow. For you and your children and your children's children. Of course, that legacy continues. Nebraska Game and Parks being a perfect example of an organization which continues to educate people on the importance of their working together to preserve nature, to teach each other the hunting skills which are important in the North American model of conservation. And of course, you amazing women that continue to grow the sports and continue to enjoy the wilderness. I can't say it enough that conservation comes in two forms, not only in the form of the hunter, but also those who do not hunt. Together, they create the perfect example of what conservation is all about. Because in a civilized and cultivated country, wild animals only continue to exist at all when preserved by sportsmen. The excellent people who protect against all hunting and consider sportsmen as enemies of wildlife are ignorant of the fact that in reality, the genuine sportsman is by all odds the most important factor in keeping the larger and more valuable wild creatures from total extermination. Nothing exemplifies this more than the sportsmen who are carefully managing their animal populations. Anthropic cascade was proven to be an important thing. Recently in Yellowstone National Park, the wild wolf was brought back, and all the large grazing animals that had been eating all of the wildlife and had been clearing the land were now forced to go back into the woods. And now, once again, we have a balance because of that. Of course, in Yellowstone, we do not have hunters, and so the wolf plays the role of a sportsman. Now, some people like it and some people don't, but the reality is that this is a balanced ecosystem that exists because certain species are clearing other species and managing the population. That is your role as a sports person, is to help assist in keeping the system in balance. You are the conservation future. It is because of you that we are able to do all the amazing things in our country that allow us to be the leader worldwide. The North American model of conservation is considered by everyone across the globe to be the model to follow when preserving our species. So I, as president, thank you very much for all of the hard work that you have done, all of the incredible things that Nebraska Game and Parks does, and the fine people there that continue to educate and grow and make people aware of the importance of sportsmanship and sports gamemanship in our great country's tradition. Thank you. Bully fun tonight to be with you. And now I'm going to open the floor to questions.
Wow, Theodore Roosevelt, thank you. That was so cool. I had never heard that program before, and I really learned a lot. So thank you.
Good, excellent.
Thank you. So everyone is on mute right now, but if you guys have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. Otherwise, I will go ahead and see if I can unmute people here. So if you would, all of you now have the option to unmute yourself if you would like to ask Theodore Roosevelt a question, or you're more likely, or you can, I guess, put them in the chat as well. It's kind of whatever you feel comfortable doing. Does anyone have any questions?
D is F and the vowel O. Well, you picked some good letters.
Does anyone
Here's someone educating a young one. Good for you.
Yes. Does anyone have any questions? You can either type them in the chat, or you can certainly unmute yourself to answer or to ask a question.
Now, can I see the chat questions at all, or?
You should be able to. There's a box at the bottom that says chat. It looks like a little bubble. And if you just click that, it should be everything that we have been.
Do I need to stop sharing my screen?
You shouldn't have to.
Because I don't see it. Oh, there's a bubble. Okay.
Yeah, Julie and I were kind of commenting on some cool stuff throughout your presentation, but it looks like someone did ask, how many national parks have you visited?
How many national parks have I visited? Well, when I was president, there were 10 national parks. Now, the thing that we need to understand about national parks, oops, I think I started something here. There we go.
Oh, that's okay. It's just
Okay.
the closed captioning.
Okay. When I was president, national parks were created and still are by Congress. Now, of the 5 national parks that I created, only 2 continue to exist as national parks. 3 of them were converted into other uses by the government later on. Now, here's an important thing. We all know, I hope, that the first national park, of course, was Yellowstone National Park. I'm going to ask it as a quiz question here. Does anyone know what the second national park was? I'm not seeing anyone. I thought usually somebody might say Yosemite or something like that. The second national park was actually Mackinac Island. Now, of course, Mackinac Island is no longer a national park. It is now a state park, and it is a national monument, I believe, for the 4th. But the point being is that what Congress has created, Congress has taken away, can take away. So it's very important that we as citizens, as part of our conservation movement, continue to ask for national parks. Not only the ones that, that exist, and ask that they remain to be funded and continue to be developed, but that new ones continue. Now, I know that wasn't the answer to the question. I'll get to that one in just a moment. The national parks that I have visited about 20 of the national parks. Some of them I got to visit during our centennial, where the National Parks Service sent me around, and I was able to visit a great many of national parks to celebrate our centennial. So I'm very fortunate to go to them. I have met people that have been to all of them, some of them that have been to every single national park as well as national monument, including a young girl of 11 who has seen all of them twice. I got to pin a badge on her for doing that, which was quite an amazing thing. And by the way, I will bring this up. If you have a 4th grader that you know this year, or is that you know or are a friend with, or perhaps a grandparent or a parent of, all 4th graders can go to national parks for free. And they can take all of whoever's in the car with them in for free. So if you don't know a 4th grader, meet one quickly, because your summer could be quite busy.
All right. Maybe, Teddy, would you like to stop sharing your screen, and then that way, sorry, we could see your face too. That would be, some people were asking to see your face. So there we go. Someone else also asked, how long have you been being Theodore Roosevelt?
Okay. You're going to ask a question of the man who's behind the glasses. Good question. I have been Theodore Roosevelt for 13 years approximately. In a normal year, a non-COVID year, I will speak in front of about 120,000 people during the year. There are 2 events that I typically do in Nebraska every year. I do the Fort Kearny Expo in the spring, where we have students that come into camp, and they give a chance to spend time with me, as well as do a variety of amazing things. And then in the fall, I'm at Ponca State Park. And please, if we do have that event this year, please come and visit camp, because I love spending time in my camp. Now, I have an 1880 hunting camp that I set up at these events, and people come and visit. We have boxes you can sit down on. When I say boxes, crates, and we can have one-on-one conversations. You can see how I live. Okay, there we are. We are planning on the Ponca Expo. Excellent. Thank you, Julia. You can come in and visit. You can see how I live in my camp, and I do live in camp during the entire time. We have firearms, we have hunting trophies, we have history stories, we have conservation stories, a lot of things going on throughout the day. Of course, I travel for the National Park Service, so I do a variety of things in our national parks throughout the year, as well as many conservation work. So I have been blessed to be able to do this. Amazing thing to recreate an amazing man with a lot of history behind him, and of course, a lot of work in conservation, which I adore. And I should add that excuse me, I do spend time in Washington, D.C., meeting with our legislators, with congressmen and senators, to promote what I'm talking about, to promote the idea of, yes, the 4th grade does count for national monuments as well. Yes. I do that as meeting with senators and congressmen, excuse me, to promote the idea that there are more national parks needed. As a matter of fact, I met with the Obama administration and was one of the critical people to help create the Oregon Peak Desert Mountain National Monument. Is there a national park of the redwood forest? Well, of course there are. Excuse me. There's the Redwoods National Forest, and of course there's a lot of national monuments in California as well. So yes.
Someone else, Christy asked the question a little earlier. Which was the last state to hold the last of the American bison?
I'm sorry, rephrase that. The state
yeah,
to hold.
Yeah, her question is, which was the last state to hold the last of the American bison?
Ooh, there's a great question. Well, you know, I honestly don't know because there were herds all around. Now, there were, by the time I became president, there were approximately 700 bison left. Remember, we went from 40 million to 700. Many of those bisons were held by ranchers. And the reason they were held by ranchers is ranchers believed that if they could breed their cattle with bison, they could have sort of a super cow. The idea is that bison have these very large heads and they can use their heads to clear snow, which a cow doesn't do. Bison are very smart. So they would clear the snow with their heads. Now, the ranchers thought if they could combine these two animals, they could create an amazing cow. And what they got was they got something called a beefalo, which is a combination between beef and bison. And what they basically got was a wild animal. Most of the bison that were beefalos looked like bison. In matter of fact, so much so that a place called the Minnesota Zoo at one point had in their bison display what they thought were bison. And later, when they did a DNA testing, discovered that they were beefalo. So the true bisons existed at the National Bison Reserve. Up in Montana. They were in Yellowstone National Park. I don't know. Does Christy have a different answer than I have? I'd be curious to hear her answer.
I don't think she posted anything yet.
Okay, we'll see. Maybe she has a Nebraska history lesson for me here.
Because I want to say that Nebraska has a few on the Nature Conservancy property out by Aurora. I want to say that we have a few true bison still out there. Otherwise, my knowledge is that the only ones still exist in Yellowstone. Is that right, Teddy?
Well, of course there are wild bison in Yellowstone. There's a herd of about 4,500 in the summertime that goes down to about 3,000 in the wintertime due to various kills by wild wolf or whatever. I would guess that that Colonel Cody probably had a few bison on his farm or ranch in the era, would be my guess. Custer Park, good point. Yes, South Dakota Custer Park, actually, up until recently was not, they were beefalo. So actually Custer Park recently has had their herd, not recently, probably in the last 20 years, has had their herd purified. So now they do have pure bison. Why were they killed? Great question. So there's a lot of reasons for that. The very first one, of course, is as they were moving the trains across the country, they were trying to feed the railroad workers. And that's why Buffalo Bill Cody was so famous, because he was a scout and a hunter for feeding the railroads. That's one reason that the bison disappeared. A second reason that the bison disappeared was for sport. It was very easy for the trains to go across the prairie, and all they had to do was shoot out of the windows and they could kill a bison out on the plains. That would be another reason. Another reason was, of course, was that because it was a primary food source and, well, the primary source for food and clothing and shelter for the Native American Indian. And unfortunately, it was one of the ways that they decided that they thought, there are 3 bison at Scouts Ranch. Thank you. They thought that by eradicating the bison herd that they could move the Native Americans either off of their land or eradicate the North American Native American, which is a very sad statement, but it's unfortunately the truth. You have to understand that the amount of bison murdered in a single year was an amazing number. 4 to 5 million a year were being murdered by hunters. And of course, now we shake our heads and go, we can't imagine that would be something that would happen. But of course, that was happening to all of our animal species. Some species don't exist anymore because of this type of viewpoint. Thankfully, the bison was saved. more by ranchers than anything. But of course, we also have a variety of birds that were totally eradicated. Some that were eradicated for women's hats, and some that were just made because of the amazing food source they had. Pigeon pie, the carrier or the passenger pigeon, was eradicated from the entire population because of its food sources. Thank you, Jeff. Jeff says eradicated in 1800s from Nebraska for the bison. Great question.
Yeah, someone else also asked a question a little earlier on. Who do you think was the greatest influence on Teddy Roosevelt in his understanding of modern conservation?
Great question. So there's a lot of people that are very important. So I would say that, as a young boy, it was his uncle, Robert B. Roosevelt. Robert B. Roosevelt was a fisherman. He was a politician, but he loved angling. And he would go down to the river and he would angle, and he would notice that less and less fish were available for him to catch. And so he studied in Europe to find out what they were doing, and he found out that they had fish hatcheries. So he brought the concept to the state of New York, and he became known as the father of the fishes. And so I think that's an important person as he's growing up. His parents were very influential. His father certainly supported anything that Theodore did in going out into the wilderness. His mother, not so much, but Theodore Sr. for sure did, and said, go collect things, go write about them. They gave him lots of book reports that he was to do. He was an avid reader, so he spent a lot of time reading about animals. And then for his 13th birthday, his father gave him taxidermy lessons from Mr. Bell from the Museum of Natural History. Now, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., Theodore's father, funded the Natural History Museum in New York City. And so as a gift to his son, he gave him taxidermy lessons by the top taxidermist of the day. And so Theodore, as he was collecting his specimens, soon was stuffing them to the point that he had a very large collection of stuffed animals in his room. By the age of 13, his grandfather had given him his first shotgun. And so everybody truly in the family supported him. George Byrd Grinnell being a very important person later on after he wrote his book. Great question. Really great.
Yeah, that was a good question. All right. Let's see. Any other questions or anything? It looks like just some comments about bison. I do, while we have kind of a little bit of a break here, while people are still maybe thinking of some questions, just letting everybody know that we do have a couple more events coming up throughout the month of March. Thursdays seem to be a really popular day. So actually next Thursday, the 18th, we will be having another birding event. Actually, this one is going to be honoring, it's called Women Who Bird, and it will be honoring Marion Langan and Mary Baumberger Brown, who were two very influential women in Nebraska ornithology. So talking to their family and friends about just their history and conservation and the projects that they worked on and all the cool things that they did in Nebraska. So that will be another virtual event coming up on March 18th. That will be actually at 5:30 p.m. Be careful in the times with that one because it might be mountain time. So you can find all of this at outdoornebraska.gov/now, or Nebraska Outdoor Women. And we also have another birding event on March 30th. And then to kind of wrap up the month of March, we will be having a all women career panel. So we will be having 6 or 7 women that are currently in the conservation field here in Nebraska, kind of talk to us a little bit about their successes, their failures as women, the projects that they do, their jobs, what do they love about their jobs, and really celebrating and highlighting what they're doing currently in this modern era and being a woman in the conservation field. So don't miss that one. That is also a virtual event, and that one will start at 7 p.m. on March 25th. So, and again, you can find all that at outdoornebraska.gov/NOW. But does anyone else have any questions for Theodore Roosevelt? We can kind of start wrapping up. So speak now or forever hold your peace, I guess. Theodore, is there a way that we can possibly contact you if you have any questions or?
Absolutely. So you can find me through my website, teddyrooseveltlive.com, and you can ask me questions there. And I want to emphasize here, I don't know if everyone here realizes what a resource you have in Nebraska Games and Parks. I work all over the country, and I am very fortunate to work with Nebraska as one of my places. And I will tell you that, number one, I've made amazing friendships with great educators there in Nebraska, but they truly have a passion for teaching young people and any age person the great outdoors of any one of the skills that you want, whether you want to shoot a bow, or whether you want to paddle a kayak, or you want to learn how to hunt, or you want to learn how to use a Dutch oven. There are so many resources available to you that I just don't see anywhere else. And I think that you really have a treasure. And so I would like to say a bully thank you to all of the people at Nebraska Game and Parks, because you truly have a true treasure in your state. And I encourage you to bring the young people out into parks to enjoy them. I keep noticing all of the new parks and the new camping areas that you're building. So it's a wonderful thing. Keep up the good work. Bully, bully.
Thank you. That is quite a compliment. We really appreciate that. I don't know if Julia and Christy, it looks like you're still on. Thank you, ladies. I know you are very instrumental in that as well. So
absolutely.
I saw Jeff was on earlier, but he might have left. But thank you. Even if you're a man, thank you, Jeff. All right. Well, does anyone else have any other questions? I put Teddy's website on there. It's teddyrooseveltlive.com, and he said you can certainly ask some questions. Otherwise, thank you again. We will be getting this on our YouTube channel. So if you would like to share it with some of your friends that weren't able to make it tonight, or that simply didn't know about it, you'd like to share this with them. So again, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it. Maybe possibly next year we can do this in person. Who knows? So,
that would be bully fun. I hope we can.
Yes. And thank you, Teddy Roosevelt. We really appreciate you. You did a great job. I learned a lot. And I think
thank you so much. God bless you all, and God bless America.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you.